Today, in the center of Poland, not far from the village of Chelmno, lies a quiet forest. To the casual visitor, it seems like an ordinary place: trees, open spaces, the remnants of an old manor house. But in this silence rests the memory of one of the darkest chapters in human history. Between December 1941 and the summer of 1944, this forest and the estate within it became the site of the first Nazi extermination camp. The Germans called it Kulmhof. History remembers it as Chełmno. Chelmno was not the largest camp of the Holocaust, nor is it the most famous, yet it holds a grim distinction. It was here that the Nazis first put into practice a method of killing that would come to define the final solution. It was here that they transformed the idea of genocide into an organized system. And it was here that tens of thousands of men, women, and children met their deaths in a way that was unprecedented at the time. To understand why Chelmno matters, we must place it in context. By late 1941, the Second World War had expanded across the European continent. Nazi Germany had already conquered Poland and large parts of the Soviet Union. Millions of Jews were under German control, forced into ghettos, subjected to violence, and marked for destruction. Up to this point, mass killings were carried out primarily by shootings. Mobile units known as the Einsatzgruppen followed the German army into conquered territories and murdered Jews, Roma, and political opponents by the hundreds of thousands. But this method, though brutally effective, had its limitations. Shooting was public. It required ammunition and manpower. It also placed a psychological burden on the killers, many of whom struggled with the sheer brutality of the task. The Nazi leadership wanted something different. They sought a process that would be more efficient, more secret, and less demanding on the men who carried it out. What they envisioned was a method of killing that would resemble an industrial system, streamlined, repeatable, and largely hidden from view. Chelmno became the testing ground for this new phase of mass murder. Unlike later camps such as Auschwitz, Chelmno did not rely on stationary gas chambers built of concrete and steel. Instead, it employed a simpler and more mobile technology: the gas van. These vehicles looked like ordinary trucks, but inside the cargo compartment was sealed, and the exhaust pipe was connected so that the fumes filled the space. Victims were told they were being transported to new homes, that they were being resettled for labor. They climbed into the trucks, the doors were shut, and as the vehicles drove toward the forest, the air inside filled with deadly carbon monoxide. By the time the vans arrived at the prepared graves, the passengers were dead. In this way, Chelmno became the first camp whose sole purpose was extermination. There were no large barracks for prisoners, no complex network of workshops or factories. Chelmno was not about imprisonment. It was about immediate destruction. People arrived, and within hours they were gone. The numbers tell part of the story. Historians estimate that at least 150,000 people were killed at Chelmno, and some place the figure closer to 200,000. Most of the victims were Jews from the Łódź ghetto, one of the largest ghettos in occupied Poland. Others included Jews from nearby towns and villages, Roma and Sinti communities, Poles accused of resistance, and Soviet prisoners of war. Entire communities were erased in this forest, their names and identities reduced to ashes and silence. And yet, despite this, Chelmno is often less remembered than Auschwitz, Treblinka, or Majdanek. Part of the reason lies in its destruction. In 1944, as the Soviet army advanced, the Nazis dismantled the camp, burned records, and destroyed evidence. Few survived to testify, and without survivors, the memory of Chelmno was overshadowed by other camps whose structures remained standing and whose survivors could speak in greater numbers. But forgetting Chelmno means overlooking a crucial moment in the history of the Holocaust. This was the place where extermination became policy, where the transition from mass shootings to systematic gassing was first put into practice. The lessons of Chelmno are not confined to history. They remain warnings of how ideology, bureaucracy, and technology can be combined to produce unimaginable crimes. In the chapters that follow, we will explore the full story of Chelmno. We will examine how it came to exist, how it operated, who its victims were, and what traces of it remain today. We will listen to the testimonies of the few who survived and the evidence gathered after the war, and we will place Chełmno in its rightful place within the larger history of the Holocaust, not as a footnote, but as a starting point, the first death factory of Nazi Europe. This is the story of Chełmno. The story of Chelmno cannot be understood in isolation. To see why it was created, we must step back and examine the world of occupied Poland after 1939 and the larger framework of Nazi ideology that made extermination camps possible. When German forces invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, the Second World War began. The Polish army resisted bravely, but the country was quickly overwhelmed. Within weeks, Poland was divided. The western regions annexed directly into the German Reich, the central territories turned into what was called the General Government, and the eastern areas occupied by the Soviet Union under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This conquest brought millions of Jews under German control. Before the war, Poland was home to the largest Jewish community in Europe. Around 3 million Jews lived across its cities, towns, and villages. In places like Warsaw, Łódź, Krakow, and Lublin, Jewish culture thrived. The invasion turned this population into captives overnight. Nazi ideology had long targeted Jews as the supposed root of Germany's problems. In Adolf Hitler's worldview, Jews were not just a religious or cultural group. They were a racial enemy, blamed for communism, capitalism, and Germany's defeat in the First World War. The Nazi program sought to eliminate Jewish life entirely from Europe. But how this elimination would take place evolved as the war progressed. At first, Nazi policy focused on exclusion and forced emigration. Jews were stripped of rights, property, and livelihoods. They were driven into ghettos, walled-off districts in major cities, where they were confined, starved, and exploited for labor. In Warsaw, over 400,000 Jews were crammed into a tiny area, living in unimaginable conditions. In Łódź, the second largest ghetto, more than 160,000 people were trapped. These ghettos became prisons, holding pens for communities whose future was grimly uncertain. Meanwhile, as the German army advanced eastward into the Soviet Union in 1941, a new phase of mass killing began. Special units known as the Einsatzgruppen followed behind the front lines. Their orders were to eliminate perceived enemies, Jews, communists, Roma, and anyone considered a threat to Nazi rule. In towns and villages across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, Jews were rounded up, marched to the outskirts, and shot in large numbers. At Babi Yar, outside Kiev, more than 33,000 Jews were executed in just 2 days in September 1941. These massacres revealed both the brutality and the limitations of mass shootings. On one hand, they showed the determination of the Nazis to wipe out Jewish communities wherever they could. On the other hand, they raised logistical and psychological problems. Shooting required soldiers, bullets, and time. It also forced men to kill at close range, often in front of women and children. While some killers carried out their orders with zeal, others faltered or suffered breakdowns. For the Nazi leadership, this was an inefficiency they wished to correct. It was in this context that the idea of a new system began to form. A system where killing would be impersonal, hidden, and easier to carry out on a large scale. Already the Nazis had experimented with gas as a method of murder. Beginning in 1939, the so-called euthanasia program, known as Action T4, targeted disabled and mentally ill Germans. Patients were removed from hospitals and institutions, taken to special centres, and killed using carbon monoxide gas in sealed chambers disguised as showers. By 1941, Around 70,000 people had been killed in this way. Public protests eventually forced Hitler to officially halt the program, but the technology and expertise were not abandoned. Instead, they were transferred to the occupied territories, where secrecy was easier to maintain. Chelmno was born from this transfer. In late 1941, as the Nazis planned the next phase of the final solution, they selected this small village near the town of Koło in central Poland as the site for an experimental extermination facility. Its location was ideal from the Nazi perspective. It was in the Wartheland, a region annexed directly into Germany. It was surrounded by forests that could conceal the killings, and it was close to the Łódź ghetto, which held one of the largest concentrations of Jews in occupied Poland. The plan for Chełmno was straightforward. Unlike Auschwitz, which developed into a vast complex combining forced labor with mass murder, Chelmno would serve one purpose alone: extermination. People would be brought in, processed, killed and buried, all within hours of arrival. There would be no long-term imprisonment, no barracks, no industries. Chełmno was not a concentration camp, it was a killing centre. The choice of method was also significant. Rather than building permanent gas chambers, the camp would use gas vans, large vehicles that could be moved, cleaned and disguised as ordinary transport. These vans had already been tested during the euthanasia program in Germany, and they represented a cruel innovation: killing on wheels. Victims would not know they were stepping into a gas chamber. They would think they were being transported. The deception was central to the process. This background, the invasion of Poland, the ghettos, the Einsatzgruppen shootings and the euthanasia program, set the stage for Chelmno. It was here that the Nazis combined all of these elements: the ideology of extermination, the desire for efficiency, the technology of gas, and the secrecy of remote forests. What began as an experiment in late 1941 would soon become a model, replicated at Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, and eventually at Auschwitz. The decision to build Chelmno was not made in isolation. It was part of the broader Nazi plan known as the final solution to the Jewish question. This plan would be formally coordinated at the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, but Chelmno was already in operation by then. In many ways, it was the prototype that showed the final solution could be carried out not just in theory, but in practice. By the time the camp became operational, the machinery of genocide was ready. The staff was assembled, the site prepared, the gas vans waiting. And from December 1941 onward, trainloads of Jews began arriving at a place where there was no future, no escape, and no chance of survival. Chelmno was not the largest camp, but in historical terms, it was one of the most significant. It was the first extermination camp, the first death factory of the Holocaust. And it was the place where the Nazis proved to themselves that entire communities could be erased, systematically and efficiently, without the chaos of mass shootings or the visibility of public massacres. This is the historical background that explains why Chelmno existed. It was the product of ideology, war, technology, and bureaucracy, and it was about to become the scene of mass killing on a scale the world had never witnessed before. By late 1941, the decision had been made. The Nazi leadership in the Wartheland, the part of Western Poland annexed directly into Germany, would establish a new kind of camp. The chosen site was Chelmno, a small village near the town of Koło, surrounded by forests and farmland. It was not an obvious choice to outsiders, but to the Nazis its isolation was an asset. The forest would hide the evidence. The proximity to rail lines would ensure a steady flow of victims, and the presence of a manor house, abandoned after the war began, offered ready-made buildings that could be adapted for their purposes. The camp's structure was deceptively simple. It was divided into two main areas. The first was the manor house itself, known as the Schloss. This building served as the reception point. Deportees arrived here, were held in its cellars or in outbuildings, and were prepared for what the Nazis described as resettlement. The second area lay a few kilometers away in the Rzeszów forest. This was where the mass graves had been dug. It was in this forest clearing that the victims would be unloaded, their bodies buried and later exhumed and burned. The method of killing, as already tested in the euthanasia program, would be carbon monoxide poisoning. But instead of fixed chambers, the Nazis chose to use gas vans. These were large trucks with sealed compartments at the back. A pipe connected the exhaust system directly into the compartment. Once the doors were closed and the engine was running, the carbon monoxide built up inside, suffocating everyone within. From the outside, these vehicles looked like ordinary transport trucks. This was deliberate. Deception was at the heart of the process. Victims were told they were being sent to labor camps or that they were simply being moved to another location. They were told to undress, to leave their belongings behind for collection, and to enter the trucks for transport. In reality, the drive to the forest was their final journey. By the time the vans arrived at the graves, the passengers inside were dead or dying. The bodies were then unloaded and buried by prisoners forced to work under guard. The organization of Chelmno was small compared to later extermination camps. At its height, the camp staff numbered fewer than 150 people, including German SS officers, policemen, and a group of auxiliaries, many of them recruited from among local ethnic Germans. These men had a single purpose: to ensure the smooth operation of mass murder. Their tasks ranged from overseeing deportations, to maintaining the vans, to supervising the burial crews. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the Sonderkommando, small groups of Jewish prisoners forced to carry out the grisly work of handling the dead. They were compelled to unload the corpses from the vans, strip them of valuables, and arrange them in the graves. Their labor prolonged their lives, but only temporarily. Periodically, these groups were executed and replaced to prevent survivors from spreading information about the camp. Chelmno began its operations in December 1941. Its first victims were Jews from nearby towns, brought in on horse-drawn carts and trucks. Over the following weeks, the process became more organized. Transports arrived from Koło, Dąbie, and later from the Łódź ghetto. Each new arrival was met with the same procedure: deception, gassing, disposal. Within hours, an entire transport could vanish. The killings quickly grew in scale. By early 1942, entire communities were being sent to Chełmno. Villages that had been Jewish for centuries were emptied in a matter of days. The victims, stripped of their clothes and possessions, were reduced to nameless entries in transport lists. The belongings they left behind were collected, sorted, and sent back to Germany to be distributed. Clothing, shoes, household items, even hair, everything was taken, catalogued, and reused. Nothing was wasted. The camp's system, while simple, was brutally effective. Unlike Auschwitz or Majdanek, Chelmno had no need for complex infrastructure. Its purpose was not to house prisoners, but to annihilate them upon arrival. The manor house acted as little more than a waiting room for death. The gas vans were the killing instruments. The forest was the graveyard. Word of what was happening at Chelmno did not take long to spread. Some locals noticed the constant movement of trucks, the presence of smoke and odours from the forest, and the disappearance of entire transports. The Polish underground received reports of what was happening, and in early 1942, one of the very few escapees, Slama Weiner, managed to pass detailed information about the camp to resistance groups. His testimony would become one of the first eyewitness accounts of systematic gassing. But for the victims themselves, deception remained key. Few understood their true fate until it was too late. For many, the illusion of resettlement offered a fragile hope, a hope that was destroyed within minutes of stepping into the vans. Chelmno's establishment marked a turning point in the Holocaust. It was the first facility created not for detention, not for labour, but for extermination alone. It was the prototype of the death camp system. The methods developed here, deception, transport, gassing, disposal, would be refined and scaled up in camps like Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. Auschwitz itself would later combine these methods with forced labour on an even larger scale. But Chelmno remains distinct for its simplicity and its pioneering role. It was, in every sense, a death factory. Its establishment in late 1941 signalled that the Nazis had crossed a threshold, from persecution and forced labour to industrial extermination as state policy. As operations continued into 1942, the camp would claim tens of thousands of lives. Entire transports from the Łódź ghetto would be sent here, never to return. In the forest of Rzeszów, mass graves filled at an astonishing pace, and as the killings accelerated, the machinery of death at Chełmno would evolve further, adapting to the demands of secrecy and efficiency. The foundation had been laid. Chelmno was operational. The killing had begun. For those who arrived at Chelmno, life ended within hours. Unlike Auschwitz, which combined imprisonment and labour with extermination, Chelmno offered no future. It was not a place of survival. It was a place designed for immediate death. The process began long before victims set foot in the manor house. Across towns and ghettos in the Wartheland, notices were posted and orders given. Jewish families were told to prepare for resettlement. They were instructed to pack belongings, to gather at collection points, and to bring with them only what they could carry. Many hoped they were being sent to work camps, grim but survivable places. For communities already starved and overcrowded in ghettos, the prospect of relocation sometimes carried even a trace of hope. But the trains and carts that carried them did not lead to safety. They led to Chelmno. From the Łódź ghetto, transports departed regularly, carrying thousands at a time. Families boarded cattle cars, pressed together with little food or water for journeys that ended not in a new settlement, but in the reception yard of the camp. Upon arrival at the Schloss, victims were met by SS officers and guards. The atmosphere was carefully staged to maintain calm. Prisoners were told they would be washed and disinfected before continuing their journey. They were ordered to hand over their valuables, to undress, and to tie their belongings into bundles. These items were taken to storage, sorted by forced labourers, and later shipped to Germany. The deception continued until the very last moment. Men, women, and children were led into the yard where the gas vans waited. To many, the vehicles looked like ordinary trucks. They were told they would be transported to new labour sites. Instead, the trucks themselves were the instruments of death. The victims were herded inside. The doors were sealed. Outside, the driver started the engine. As the vehicle jolted into motion, exhaust fumes were pumped into the sealed compartment. The ride to the forest lasted only a few kilometres, but by the time the van reached the mass graves, the passengers were already suffocated. Guards opened the doors to a scene of horror. Bodies twisted in final struggle, the air heavy with the stench of exhaust and death. Here, in the Rzeszów forest, prisoners from the Sonderkommando awaited. These were Jewish men forced into the most terrible of roles. Under SS supervision, they dragged the bodies from the trucks, stripped them of hidden valuables, and carried them to the pits. At first, the corpses were buried in mass graves. Later, when the Nazis feared discovery, the bodies were exhumed, stacked on makeshift pyres, and burned. The Sonderkommando lived only as long as they were useful. Periodically, they too were killed and replaced by new arrivals, ensuring that few witnesses remained alive. The pace of killing was relentless. On a typical day, several transports might arrive. Each could contain hundreds of people. Within hours, they were processed, murdered, and disposed of. The cycle repeated itself with mechanical precision. For the victims, the process was bewildering. Many had no idea where they were or what awaited them. Survivors who later testified recalled the confusion, the mixture of fear and hope. Some believed they were being taken to work. Others sensed danger but could not imagine the reality. For children, the experience was often one of fear and helplessness, clinging to parents who themselves were powerless. Life inside Chelmno, if it can be called life at all, was measured in hours. There were no barracks, no prolonged imprisonment. The Schloss served only as a temporary holding area. Once undressed and processed, victims were killed the same day. Only the Sonderkommando lived longer, but theirs was an existence of terror, forced to participate in the machinery of death while knowing they too were marked for extermination. The belongings left behind tell another story. Clothing, shoes, and household goods were collected in vast quantities. They were packed into crates sent by rail back to Germany and redistributed to civilians. In this way, the destruction of Jewish communities became not only an act of mass murder, but also a system of plunder. The victims' lives were erased, but their possessions were absorbed into the Reich. Even their hair, teeth, and ashes became part of a grotesque economy of death. As the killings accelerated, the landscape of Chełmno was transformed. The forest became a cemetery without markers, pits filled with bodies. The soil itself became saturated with human remains. Local villagers sometimes noticed the smoke and smell. The Polish underground collected reports. Rumours circulated. But the killings continued, hidden behind the facade of resettlement and the secrecy of the forest. The efficiency of Chelmno was chilling. Within a matter of months, tens of thousands had been murdered. By the end of 1942, entire Jewish communities in the Wartheland had vanished. For many, Chelmno was the final destination after years of persecution, the end point of a process that began with discrimination, ghettoization, and forced labour. Yet within this horror, fragments of resistance emerged. A handful of prisoners managed to escape, passing word of the gas vans and mass graves to the outside world. Their testimonies were some of the first to describe systematic gassing, providing crucial evidence of what was happening behind Nazi lines. Still, for the overwhelming majority, Chelmno meant silence. Families disappeared without trace. Names vanished from records. The camp was designed not only to kill, but to erase. Few photographs exist, few survivors remained, and the physical structures were destroyed before liberation. What endures are testimonies, documents, and the memory preserved in the soil of the forest. The experience of death at Chelmno illustrates the transformation of the Holocaust. Here, killing became impersonal. Guards did not face their victims as in shootings. Instead, technology did the work. A truck engine, an exhaust pipe, and a sealed compartment, these became tools of genocide. The system reduced human lives to a mechanical process: arrival, deception, gassing, disposal. It was this process that would later be replicated on a larger scale in stationary gas chambers across occupied Poland. For the men, women, and children who passed through Chelmno, the journey was terrifying and brief. They entered believing they might be relocated. Within hours, they were dead. Their lives ended in the back of a truck, their bodies dumped into pits, their possessions stolen, their voices silenced. Chelmno's daily operation stands as one of the starkest examples of how ideology, bureaucracy, and technology combined to produce industrialized killing. It was a place without hope, a place where human beings were transformed into numbers and numbers into ash. By the time the first phase of the camp ended in 1943, the death toll had already reached staggering proportions. The machinery of death had proven its effectiveness. And though Chelmno itself was briefly closed, its methods had been perfected. Methods that would be deployed at Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, and Auschwitz. Chelmno was the beginning of the end for countless communities. It was a place where life and death converged in a process designed to be swift, efficient, and absolute. To understand its operation is to understand the terrible logic of the Holocaust, a logic that sought not only to kill, but to erase whole peoples from the world. The history of Chelmno is not only a story of methods and machinery. At its heart, it is a story of people, the men, women and children who were brought here, murdered and buried in silence. To understand the scale of the crime, we must examine who these victims were, where they came from, and how many lives were extinguished in this place. The majority of those killed at Chelmno were Jews from central Poland. The largest single source was the Łódź ghetto, the second largest ghetto in all of occupied Europe. Established in 1940, the Łódź ghetto held more than 160,000 Jews at its height. Conditions inside were brutal: overcrowding, hunger, forced labour and disease. In 1942, transports from Łódź began making the short journey to Chełmno. Entire families were loaded onto trains under the guise of resettlement. In reality, they were being sent to their deaths. Other Jewish communities in the Wartherland were also targeted. From towns like Koło, Dąbie, Turek and Włocławek, Jews were rounded up and sent to Chelmno. In many of these places, Jewish life had existed for centuries. Synagogues, schools, businesses and cultural traditions had flourished. Within months, all of it was gone. The communities themselves were physically destroyed, their members buried in mass graves in the forest of Rzeszów. But Jews were not the only victims. Chelmno also became a site of murder for Roma and Sinti people. These communities, often referred to as gypsies in Nazi documents, were targeted for persecution and extermination under Nazi racial policies. At Chelmno, groups of Roma were killed in the same way as Jewish transports. Their lives ended in the gas vans, their bodies discarded in the forest. Poles were also among the victims. Some were members of the resistance, accused of opposing German rule. Others were civilians targeted in reprisal actions. The camp also claimed the lives of Soviet prisoners of war, captured on the Eastern Front and brought to Chelmno to be executed. In this way, while the overwhelming majority of victims were Jewish, the camp's machinery of death consumed people from multiple groups deemed undesirable or threatening by the Nazi regime. The exact number of victims at Chelmno is difficult to determine. The Nazis made deliberate efforts to conceal their crimes. In 1943, during a special operation known as Action 1005, mass graves were opened, bodies exhumed and burned to destroy evidence. Documents were destroyed, and when the camp was finally dismantled in 1944, little physical trace remained. Despite this, historians have reconstructed the numbers through survivor testimony, transport records, and post-war investigations. Most estimates place the death toll between 150,000 and 200,000 people. Of these, around 120,000 came from the Łódź ghetto alone. The rest were drawn from surrounding towns, villages, and minority communities. To grasp the magnitude of this number, we must think in terms of communities erased. A town with 5,000 Jews might see its entire population sent to Chelmno in a matter of days. A transport of several hundred people could be exterminated within hours of arrival. Over the course of 2.5 years, the repetition of this process, train after train, truck after truck, accumulated into one of the largest death tolls of the Holocaust's early extermination phase. Yet beyond numbers, there are individuals. Survivor testimonies, though few, remind us that behind each statistic was a person with a name, a family, a story. A child who once went to school, a mother who once prepared meals, a grandfather who once led prayers in a synagogue. Chelmno extinguished these lives without ceremony, without records, and often without leaving behind so much as a photograph. The victims were meant to vanish without trace. In this sense, Chelmno represents not only physical destruction but also cultural erasure. The Jewish life of central Poland, vibrant, diverse, centuries old, was wiped away. Whole towns lost their Jewish populations forever. The Roma and Sinti groups who passed through Chelmno suffered the same fate, part of a genocide that is often less recognized but equally devastating. For Poles and Soviet prisoners, the camp was another instrument of Nazi terror, a reminder that no one was safe under occupation. The victims of Chelmno cannot be fully counted, nor can they be fully named. But the estimates we have, and the fragments of testimony that survive, give us enough to know the enormity of the crime. Each number in the total represents a life taken, a family destroyed, a community shattered. Chełmno's role in the Holocaust was significant not only because of its pioneering methods, but also because of the sheer volume of people it consumed. Though it was smaller and less complex than Auschwitz, it still ranks among the deadliest of the extermination sites. And unlike some camps where prisoners were held for weeks or months, Chelmno's victims rarely survived more than a single day. The camp was designed for immediate total annihilation. In remembering the victims, we must recognize both the scale and the individuality of their loss. Tens of thousands perished here, and yet each had a personal history that deserved to continue. To reduce them to statistics alone is to echo the logic of those who murdered them. The task of memory is to restore their humanity, to remember them not only as victims but as people whose lives were cut short in the gas vans and forests of Chelmno. One of the most striking facts about Chelmno is how little direct testimony survived. Unlike Auschwitz, which had thousands of survivors, Chelmno left behind only a handful. The reason was simple. Almost no one sent there was intended to live. The camp was designed to eliminate every witness, every trace. Those forced into the Sonderkommando, the groups of prisoners who handled the bodies, were themselves murdered periodically, replaced by new arrivals. Yet against all odds, a few did escape. Their testimonies became vital in reconstructing the truth of what happened in this remote village. Through their words, we can glimpse the reality of Chelmno in a way no statistics or documents could ever convey. One of the earliest and most important voices was Slama Ber Weiner, also known as Yakov Grodzianowski. Weiner was a young Jewish man from Izbica in the Lublin district. In January 1942, he was deported to Chełmno and forced into the Sonderkommando. His job was to unload the corpses from the gas vans and bury them in the forest. The horror of this task is almost unimaginable. Weiner later described how the trucks arrived filled with the bodies of men, women and children, often with blood streaming from their noses and mouths, evidence of their desperate struggle for air. After a short time in the Sonderkommando, Weiner managed to escape. He made his way to the Warsaw Ghetto, where he reported what he had seen to members of the Jewish underground. His account, now known as the Grodzianowski Report, became one of the first detailed eyewitness descriptions of systematic gassing in Nazi-occupied Poland. In it, he explained the process of deception, the operation of the gas vans, and the burial of victims. He spoke of the cruelty of the guards and the impossibility of survival. This testimony was passed on to the Polish underground and eventually reached London, where it was used by the Polish government in exile to alert the Allies. It was among the earliest credible reports of the mass extermination of Jews. Tragically, Weiner himself did not survive the war. After his escape from Chelmno, he was later captured and murdered. But his words endured, providing the world with a first glimpse into the reality of extermination camps. Another survivor was Mordecai Podschlebnik, a Jewish man deported to Chelmno in 1942. Like Weiner, he was placed in the Sonderkommando. He later recalled the scenes of terror as victims were herded into the Schloss, deceived with promises of resettlement, and then loaded into the gas vans. Podschlebnik managed to escape during one of the Sonderkommando executions. After the war, he gave testimony at several trials, including the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961. His descriptions confirmed the use of gas vans, the burial of bodies, and the destruction of entire transports. A few others joined this small group of survivors. Simon Srebnik, deported as a teenager from the Łódź ghetto, survived because he was kept alive during the camp's final phase in 1944. When the Nazis tried to destroy evidence of their crimes, Srebnik was one of the prisoners forced to exhume and burn bodies. He survived a shooting during an attempted liquidation and later provided crucial testimony after the war. Decades later, his voice was captured in Claude Lanzmann's documentary Shoah, where he returned to the site of Chelmno and described what he had witnessed. His soft-spoken words remain some of the most haunting testimonies of the Holocaust. Together, these survivors formed a fragile chain of memory. Their accounts were rare, but they were enough to establish beyond doubt what Chelmno had been. They described the deception, the gas vans, the forest graves, and the systematic murder of entire communities. Resistance inside Chelmno itself was nearly impossible. The camp was small, tightly controlled, and designed for swift extermination. Victims did not live long enough to organize. The Sonderkommando, though aware of their fate, had few chances to revolt. There were no large-scale uprisings at Chełmno as there were at Treblinka or Sobibor. The most that could be attempted were desperate escapes by individuals or small groups. Outside the camp, however, the Polish underground worked to gather information. Reports from escapees like Weiner were circulated, and evidence of the mass killings reached the wider resistance movement. Locals in the area were also aware that something terrible was happening. They saw transports arrive and never return. They noticed the smoke, the smell, the constant movement of guards. Whispers spread, and though many details were uncertain, the truth could not be fully hidden. After the war, the testimonies of Chelmno's few survivors became crucial in holding perpetrators accountable. At trials in Poland, Germany, and later in Israel, men like Podschlebnik and Srebnik stood as living witnesses to crimes that the Nazis had tried to erase. Their words carried immense weight, not only in courtrooms but also in the collective memory of the Holocaust. It is important to stress how rare these voices are. Out of the estimated 150,000 to 200,000 people killed at Chelmno, fewer than 10 lived to tell the story in detail. The Nazis were nearly successful in their attempt to leave no survivors, no records, no evidence. But the survival of even a few individuals was enough to preserve the memory. These testimonies remind us that behind the statistics were real experiences, confusion, fear, betrayal, and unimaginable suffering. They also remind us of the resilience of memory. Even in the face of annihilation, fragments of truth escaped, carried by individuals who risked everything to bear witness. The resistance, escapes, and testimonies of Chelmno illustrate the broader struggle of Holocaust memory. The Nazis sought not only to kill, but also to erase, to make their crimes invisible. Yet through the courage of survivors and the persistence of those who recorded their words, the story of Chelmno endures. When we read Weiner's report, or hear Podschlebnik's testimony, or listen to Srebnik's quiet voice decades later, we are connected directly to the reality of Chelmno. These are not abstract numbers or distant events. They are lived experiences, carried across time by those who refused to let the truth be buried with the dead. In this way, the survivors of Chelmno accomplished a form of resistance that outlived the camp itself. They preserved memory, they exposed the truth, and they ensured that Chelmno, though nearly forgotten, would never be erased completely from history. By early 1943, the main purpose of Chelmno had been fulfilled. The Jewish communities of the Wartherland had been almost completely destroyed. The ghettos in smaller towns were emptied, their inhabitants sent to the manor house, the gas vans, and finally the pits of the Rzeszów forest. The Łódź ghetto, once one of the largest Jewish centres in Poland, had been drastically reduced in size through repeated deportations to Chelmno. With so few victims left to kill in the immediate region, the camp's first phase came to an end. In March 1943, the Nazis suspended operations at Chelmno. But closure did not mean abandonment. Instead, the focus shifted to concealment. The Nazis had long been aware that their crimes might one day be exposed. By 1942, reports of extermination camps were reaching the Allies. Underground networks in Poland were documenting the atrocities. Even among the German leadership, there was an understanding that the killings, if revealed, would shock the world. And so the Nazis sought to erase the evidence. This was part of a wider campaign known as Action 1005. Across occupied Poland and the Soviet Union, mass graves were opened, bodies exhumed and burned on massive pyres. The goal was to leave no trace of the massacres, no physical proof that could be discovered by advancing Allied forces. At Chelmno, this operation was carried out in the forest of Rzeszów. Jewish prisoners from the Sonderkommando were forced to perform this task. Under guard, they dug up the graves, removed decomposed bodies, and arranged them on stacks of wood and rail tracks. Fire consumed the remains. Ashes were ground down, mixed with sand, and scattered. The work was gruesome and exhausting, and once it was completed, the prisoners themselves were executed to silence witnesses. By the summer of 1943, Chelmno appeared to be gone. The manor house was partially dismantled, the forest cleared, the traces of mass graves obliterated as best as the Nazis could manage. To outside eyes, it was as if the camp had never existed. But the story did not end there. In 1944, the Germans reopened Chelmno for a grim final chapter. The reason was the liquidation of the Łódź ghetto, which by then was one of the last remaining Jewish ghettos in Poland. Even after years of deportations, around 70,000 Jews remained in Łódź, forced into labour, but still alive. The Nazi leadership decided that this ghetto too would be emptied. Chelmno was reactivated to carry out the task. This second phase of operation was shorter but no less deadly. Between June and July 1944, thousands of Jews from Łódź were transported once more to Chelmno. The system of killing resumed, though with some modifications. The manor house, damaged and partly dismantled, was no longer used as the main reception building. Instead, a new wooden barracks was constructed in the village to hold victims before they were taken to the gas vans. But the essential process remained unchanged: deception, gassing, burial, and cremation. By the end of July 1944, as Soviet forces advanced westward, the Nazis again dismantled the camp. This time, the retreat was final. The remaining Sonderkommando prisoners were executed. The wooden barracks was destroyed. Efforts were made once more to obliterate evidence in the forest. When the Red Army arrived in January 1945, they found little more than ruins and ashes. The closure of Chelmno reflected the broader Nazi strategy of denial. Unlike Auschwitz, which was liberated largely intact, Chelmno left behind only fragments. The Germans had succeeded in destroying most of the physical traces. What remained were witness testimonies, scattered documents, and the memories of locals who had seen the constant transports to the forest. Yet even in destruction, the truth could not be fully hidden. The soil of Rzeszów was still thick with ashes. Bones and fragments were still visible. Survivors who had escaped carried their stories into the post-war world. And in time, investigators pieced together the reality of what had happened in this forgotten corner of Poland. The closure of Chelmno illustrates both the efficiency of the Nazi extermination system and the extraordinary efforts made to conceal it. It shows how determined the perpetrators were not only to destroy entire communities, but also to erase the evidence of their own crimes. But history cannot be erased so easily. Though Chelmno was dismantled, its legacy endures. The survivors' testimonies, the investigations after the war, and the memorial that now stands on the site all speak to what the Nazis tried, but failed, to bury forever. When Soviet troops advanced into central Poland in January 1945, they found the remains of Chelmno. The manor house was partly destroyed, the wooden barracks had been dismantled. The forest clearing was littered with ashes and bones, silent witnesses to mass murder. The Nazis had tried to erase the camp from history, but traces of their crimes remained. Almost immediately after the war, efforts began to investigate what had happened here. Polish authorities conducted inquiries, interviewing local villagers, examining the forest, and collecting fragments of evidence. The testimonies of the very few survivors were recorded, and the picture of Chelmno slowly began to take shape. The search for justice extended beyond Poland. At the Nuremberg trials in 1945 to 1946, the existence of extermination camps was a central charge against the Nazi leadership. Chelmno was mentioned, but it was often overshadowed by Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek. The lack of surviving structures and the small number of witnesses meant that Chelmno did not dominate the proceedings in the same way. Still, its name entered the record of Nazi crimes against humanity. In the years that followed, a series of trials in Poland and Germany focused more directly on Chelmno's perpetrators. Among them was Hans Bothmann, the camp's final commandant. Bothmann oversaw the second phase of operations in 1944. Arrested after the war, he was held in British custody but committed suicide before he could be brought to trial. Other members of the camp staff were prosecuted in Poland during the late 1940s. Some were sentenced to death, others to prison terms. In West Germany, trials took place in the 1960s. A number of Chelmno personnel were tried in Bonn and later in Cologne. These proceedings relied heavily on survivor testimony, particularly from men like Mordecai Podschlebnik and Simon Srebnik, who travelled to Germany to recount what they had witnessed. Their words were direct and harrowing, leaving no doubt about the nature of the crimes. Yet the sentences handed down were often relatively light. Many defendants received prison terms of only a few years. The scale of their crimes far outweighed the punishment. This gap between the enormity of the atrocity and the limited justice achieved was not unique to Chelmno. Across post-war Europe, many perpetrators of the Holocaust escaped prosecution altogether. Some blended back into civilian life. Others were shielded by the chaos of the post-war years or by political priorities during the Cold War. For the victims and survivors, this failure to fully punish those responsible was a source of lasting pain. Despite these shortcomings, the trials did serve an important purpose. They brought Chelmno into public awareness. They established in courts of law that extermination had taken place there, that gas vans had been used, and that tens of thousands had been murdered. They created a permanent record of testimony and evidence that could not be erased, even if justice was incomplete. Memory of Chelmno itself also began to take shape in the decades after the war. In the 1960s, a memorial was established on the site of the camp. Today, the Chelmno Museum of Martyrdom preserves the ruins of the manor house, the remains of the forest clearings, and a series of monuments. Visitors can walk through the grounds, see the outlines of mass graves, and confront the silence of a place once filled with unimaginable suffering. For many years, however, Chelmno remained relatively unknown compared to Auschwitz. The scale of Auschwitz, its liberation by Soviet troops in 1945, and the number of survivors who could testify gave it a central place in Holocaust history. Chelmno, by contrast, had few survivors, little visible infrastructure, and had been deliberately destroyed. It was easier to overlook. Historians sometimes referred to it as the forgotten death camp. But to forget Chelmno is to misunderstand the Holocaust. It was here, after all, that the first extermination camp was created. It was here that the Nazis developed the method of killing by gas that would later be expanded across occupied Poland. It was here that entire communities vanished in a matter of months. Auschwitz may symbolize the Holocaust in global memory, but Chelmno was where the blueprint was tested. Over time, scholarship has restored Chelmno to its rightful place in history. Researchers have pieced together the story through survivor accounts, German documents, and post-war investigations. Books and documentaries have ensured that the camp is no longer entirely overshadowed. The memorial in Poland stands as both a historical site and a place of mourning, reminding visitors of the lives lost. The testimonies recorded after the war remain the most powerful voices of memory. When Mordecai Podschlebnik took the stand in German courts, or when Simon Srebnik spoke decades later in Shoah, they ensured that Chelmno could never be erased completely. Their words bridged the gap between silence and history, carrying the truth across generations. The trials and the memorialization of Chelmno show both the difficulties and the possibilities of post-war justice and remembrance. On one hand, many perpetrators escaped full accountability, and the camp remained less recognized for decades. On the other, the truth survived, preserved in testimony, research, and commemoration. Today, Chełmno is part of the broader landscape of Holocaust memory. It is a place visited by students, scholars, and relatives of victims. It is a reminder that even in small, seemingly ordinary places, unimaginable crimes can occur. It is proof of how ideology, technology, and bureaucracy combined to produce genocide. And it is a warning that such crimes must never be forgotten. In remembering Chelmno, we remember not only the victims who perished there, but also the responsibility to confront denial, indifference, and forgetting. Memory itself becomes a form of justice, one that continues long after the trials have ended. Chelmno was not the largest extermination camp of the Holocaust, nor was it the most infamous. It left behind few ruins, few survivors, and for many years it remained a shadow in history. Yet its significance cannot be overstated. It was here, in December 1941, that the Nazis first created a facility designed solely for mass extermination. It was here that the method of killing by gas was implemented on a large scale for the first time. It was here that entire communities, from the Łódź ghetto and beyond, were annihilated in a matter of hours. Chelmno represents a turning point. Before it, mass murder had been carried out primarily through shootings by the Einsatzgruppen, brutal but chaotic, often visible to local populations, and taxing even on the perpetrators. With Chelmno, killing became systematic, industrial, and hidden. Technology replaced bullets. Trucks replaced firing squads. Deception replaced open violence. It was a new stage of genocide, one that would soon be replicated and expanded in Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, and Auschwitz. The human cost was immense. At least 150,000 people were murdered at Chelmno, perhaps as many as 200,000. Jews, Roma, Poles, and Soviet prisoners all perished in the gas vans and in the forest of Rzeszów. Their names were meant to vanish, their lives reduced to ashes and scattered remains. And yet, against the Nazis' determination to erase all evidence, fragments of truth survived. Survivors like Slama Bear-Weiner, Mordecai Podślebnik, and Simon Srebnik carried their testimonies into the world. Local witnesses reported what they saw. Post-war investigators uncovered remains in the forest. Historians pieced together the record. Together, these voices ensured that Chelmno would not be lost to silence. The legacy of Chelmno challenges us today. It reminds us of how quickly human beings can transform ideology and prejudice into organized destruction. It shows the danger of bureaucracy stripped of morality, of technology turned to inhuman ends. It warns us of what happens when hatred is allowed to become policy, when entire populations are dehumanized and treated as disposable. At the same time, Chelmno reminds us of the importance of memory. For decades, it was less known than Auschwitz, Treblinka, or Majdanek. But the work of survivors, historians, and educators has restored its place in the history of the Holocaust. To remember Chelmno is to honor its victims, to give back at least some measure of dignity to those who were meant to be forgotten. Today, visitors can walk through the grounds of the memorial at Chelmno. They can see the remains of the manor house, the outlines of the forest clearings, and the monuments erected to commemorate the dead. The silence of the site is heavy, but it speaks. It speaks of lives cut short, of families destroyed, of communities erased. It speaks of the dangers of forgetting. In telling the story of Chelmno, we bear witness. We ensure that the first extermination camp of the Holocaust is not lost in the shadows of history. We confront the reality of what happened in this ordinary-looking forest, and in doing so, we strengthen our resolve to prevent such crimes in the future. Chelmno was, in many ways, the beginning of the Holocaust's machinery of death. Remembering it is essential not only for honouring the victims, but for understanding the mechanisms of genocide itself. It is a story of horror, but also of warning, and it is a story we must continue to tell. If you found this video meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps more people hear and remember these stories.